At the Royal Rumble in January 1994, The Undertaker faced Yokozuna for the WWF Championship in a casket match. It really felt like the irresistible force was meeting the immovable object. The Undertaker was one of the WWF's biggest wrestlers in terms of height at the time, and the Federation was obsessed with pitting him against equally big opponents. His feud before the 600-pound Yokozuna was against the massive but incompetent Giant Gonzalez, who he defeated at WrestleMania 9 in what would be considered The Undertaker's worst match for decades. The match ended Giant Gonzalez's career as he was released from his contract at the end of October 1993. Luckily, Vince McMahon realised it was Gonzalez that was the problem, rather than The Undertaker. In the 4 years that followed, Undertaker gained a fearsome reputation as an unstoppable fiend in the ring, a genuinely terrifying character for the kids at home. At one moment he would be plodding almost like a zombie before breaking out huge moves that defied his size, dazing his opponents into submission. The Undertaker burned through legends like Jimmy Snuka and The Ultimate Warrior, en route to defeating Hulk Hogan for the WWF title in 1991, as Vince and company quite rightly strapped the rocket to The Undertaker, giving him wins against genuine superstars and ultimately the biggest prize in the business. The Undertaker was one of the best creations wrestling had mustered up in ages and was booked incredibly strongly for the first couple of years, but we all know Vince McMahon likes to see big men fighting each other. Yokozuna was a sumo wrestler that was clearly Samoan, not Japanese, but nobody spoke about that. A 500-pound wrestler with the agility of a grappler half his size, Yokozuna was also being pushed hard by the Federation in the early 90s. Yoko eliminated the legendary Randy Savage at the 1993 Royal Rumble before trouncing 80s superstar Koko Beware. A challenge from Hacksaw Jim Duggan came next, as Duggan wanted to be the first man to take Yokozuna's feet from underneath him. While Duggan won the challenge, he lost the war as Yoko administered 4 bonsai drops to him, apparently causing him internal bleeding. Feuds with top-level talents like Lex Luger, Bret Hart and Hulk Hogan thrust Yokozuna into the main event, with him winning the WWF Championship in June 1993 at the King of the Ring. Just like The Undertaker, Yokozuna continued to be booked strong, and that's what made the casket match between the two so exciting. At the Survivor Series, the team of evil foreigners made up of Yokozuna, Ludwig Borger, Quebecer Jack and Crush faced off against the All-American side of Lex Luger, Tatanka, the Steiner brothers and The Undertaker. The Yokozuna vs Undertaker interactions were what stole the show. Teasing the audience, they both got counted out of the match, leaving their showdown for another night. The Undertaker challenged Yokozuna to a casket match for Yokozuna's WWF title, and just by chance, it turned out Yoko was deadly scared of caskets. Score 1 to The Undertaker, as he and Paul Bearer got to building a massive casket just to accommodate the 600-pound Samoan. Royal Rumble 1994 rolled around, and it was time for the casket match with the belt on the line. This gimmick was a stroke of genius. For the fans, there had to be a winner, and for the wrestlers, neither of them had to go out on a pinfall loss. Both big men had been booked so strongly beforehand, it was difficult to conceive a winner early on. Yoko sold his fear of the coffin so convincingly, it looked like he was going to fill his tights. For the first time ever, Yokozuna looked vulnerable, selling for The Undertaker before the bell had even rang. The match began, and their agility was on display from the get-go. Undertaker dominated early, leaving his feet with a flying lariat after a bunch of failed clotheslines as he attempted to knock Yokozuna down. Yokozuna came back with salt to the eyes of The Undertaker, blinding him before whacking him with a folding chair and smashing his head into the steps. The match went back and forth, a belly-to-belly slam from Yoko to The Undertaker, but The Undertaker sits up, planting Yoko with a huge DDT. They used all the tricks in the book in this back and forth big man match. Yoko lay in the coffin for a while as The Undertaker tried to take care of Yoko's friends from backstage, Bearing in mind there's no disqualification in a casket match. The match broke down as The Undertaker tried to fend off the 8-man ambush, fighting to stay out of the triple wide coffin. Each of the heels performed their finisher on the dead man, finally leaving him unconscious before flopping his lifeless body into the casket, giving Yokozuna one of the screwiest wins ever. As the casket is wheeled towards the exit, smoke billowed from the casket and the arena went dark. The Undertaker appeared to rise towards the ceiling of the arena, not to be seen again. Not to be seen for 7 months anyway. And that's how you book a big man match. Both men were incredibly agile for their respective sizes, but this way both The Undertaker looked almost invincibly strong in defeat, and Yokozuna got a ton of heel heat. Perhaps the WWF had learned from The Undertaker vs Giant Gonzalez debacle after all. Or perhaps they hadn't. For the fans at the time, The Undertaker seemed to have disappeared for good. Months rolled by without any sign of the dead man. In reality, he was taking 7 months off to heal from a terrible back injury, and by the spring, plans were already in the works for his return. The problem was, there wasn't anyone to book him against when he did come back. I mean, there were dozens of wrestlers on the roster that could have benefited from working with The Undertaker, but none of them were 7 foot tall, and apparently Vince wanted another big man feud. Yokozuna's shine had already begun to fade after losing the belt to Bret Hart at WrestleMania, even though a continuation of the feud would have made sense, and it's a shame that's not what happened, as what was to be concocted was a load of rubbish that made no sense on a number of levels. After WrestleMania 10, the WWF started airing segments where so-called members of the public said they'd seen The Undertaker out and about. These skits are worth watching for the acting alone, by the way. The lack of effort on display during this angle is so bad it's funny. Ted DiBiase, the man who introduced The Undertaker to the company in the first place, finally stated he would be bringing The Undertaker back. Paul Bearer denied his claims, instead stating that he knew where The Undertaker was. In an odd twist, the WWF brought in Leslie Nielsen of the Naked Gun films to try and get to the bottom of the mystery. Because, you know, he was a real life cop and not an actor. He appeared on several episodes of Raw, investigating the situation. Ted DiBiase made good on his claim by delivering The Undertaker, or a close approximation of The Undertaker, to WWF television. This version of The Undertaker proceeded to squash jobbers on episodes of Raw to fans that instantly realised he was an imposter. The mannerisms of this version of The Undertaker were almost spot on, but that's the only credit I can give to this gimmick. The Underfaker, as we'll call him from now on, was noticeably shorter than The Undertaker, and his face was different, and that was the main problem. No matter how much they tried to cover it up with his big hat and loads of smoke during the entrance, he just had a different face. Yes, he was a big guy and would probably have been a good fit as an opponent for The Undertaker if he'd had a different gimmick. He would have certainly ticked Vince's box regarding big men opponents for Taker, but nobody was buying that this was the Phenom himself. This was in fact a man by the name of Brian Lee, a friend to The Undertaker in real life, and a journeyman wrestler who wrestled for SMW at the time and previously appeared in territories across the country. After this, he'd go on to work for both WCW and TNA. There was consideration that if this match and storyline went well, he would be kept on with the WWF, possibly under the same gimmick, but it turned out that neither the storyline or the match went well at all. Often in wrestling, the joy is in the surprise. Anything can happen in the WWF, Vince McMahon used to bellow every week from the commentary booth. This time around, there was no doubt in anyone's mind with what happened next, because the WWF spoiled their own storyline 3 weeks in advance. While The Underfaker was still squashing local talent every week, the WWF decided to make good on their partnership with Domino's Pizza and advertise the main event for SummerSlam on their pizza boxes. All of their pizza boxes had the words Undertaker vs Undertaker at SummerSlam written on it, thus spoiling the storyline before it was even revealed on television. The Undertaker had been lucky to have been protected from bad storylines for most of his time in the Federation. Luckily, the absolute turds like this and the Giant Gonzalez rubbish were handled very early on in his career. The fans turned on the story immediately upon the debut of the fake Undertaker. It didn't matter what lengths the WWF went to in order to fool them, nothing worked. What made this whole thing really perplexing was the fact that the angle was intended to revive WWF's flagging fortunes in 1994, and yet so little effort was made. Paul Bearer had a bit of a go at making the Undertaker come to him with his urn and his silly voice. Some lights flashed on and off during a segment with the Heartbreak Hotel and Shawn Michaels. The whole thing was just the pits, really. On the night of the match, Bret Hart's match with his brother Owen had gone on longer than scheduled by about 10 minutes, thus eating into the Undertaker's main event time. The Undertaker was apparently furious about this, but knowing what followed, I'd like to take this opportunity to personally thank Bret Hart for doing that for us, because I don't think I could stand another 10 minutes of what we were about to see. The real Undertaker came to the ring and actually got a huge ovation from the crowd when his silhouette appeared in the entranceway. At this point, the audience must have been so wound up. They were at a fever pitch to actually see the man himself after suffering with the Underfaker on television for the last month and a half. When the two men eventually stood toe to toe, I actually laughed out loud due to the height difference. It's ridiculous. You can see there is 4 or 5 inches in height difference between them. The match itself was boring and rubbish, I think it's fair to say. Once the novelty of the real dead man being back had worn off, it was crickets for the match itself. Luckily for the fans both at home and in attendance, it lasted just 8 minutes. A dull, mostly one-sided affair that included some mediocre outside brawling, followed by a tombstone, and another tombstone, then the 1, 2, 3. Upon seeing this match backstage, Vince immediately axed any further involvement with the fake Undertaker, and the whole thing was buried within a week. No rematch, no rumoured tag team between the two, and knowing how the legendary career of the Undertaker would go, that's probably for the best.